In this video, we'll take a tour of two panels that you'll be using a lot in After Effects, the Composition panel and the Layer panel. Let's begin by choosing a workspace in which we can see both the Composition panel and the Layer panel side by side. We'll start with the Minimal workspace by choosing Window, Workspace, Minimal, and then choose Window, Layer, then drag the Layer panel's tab and drop it in this drop zone here, so that we have side-by-side panels. I'll also make the timeline panel a little bit smaller. There. The composition panel shows us our entire composition. We can see multiple layers at once. For example, we have our vector graphics bug here, which we can see is the logo precomposition layer. We have an adjustment layer, which doesn't appear except for its result, which is to apply an effect to the underlying layer. And we have our palette and footage layer. In contrast, in the layer panel, we only see one layer at a time. In this case, the palette and footage layer, as indicated here. You can show a different layer in the layer panel by clicking this triangle and choosing from the menu. Here, our adjustment layer, which is really a white solid with an effect applied to it, doesn't look very interesting. So let's go back to the palette and footage layer. The composition panel and layer panel share many controls. One of them is the magnification ratio. If we choose a value such as 100%, it determines how close we are zoomed in the panel. We can do the same thing here in the layer panel. Note that when working with high definition or cinema size frames, you'll very often need to use a magnification ratio other than 100%, especially when working on a small display like the one that we're using now. If I choose 25%, I can easily see the entire frame. However, it doesn't really make much sense for After Effects to render every single pixel to only throw away most of them when only presenting a 25% view in the composition panel. So I can choose quarter here, and After Effects will only render the pixels that it needs for a 25% view. You can set this to be automatic by choosing Auto, so that now if I go to 50%, notice that this value changed to half. This setting here, the resolution downsample factor, also affects the layer panel, but the layer panel does not have its own control for setting this. Notice that if I have the composition panel set to quarter in the resolution downsample factor, but I'm viewing at 100% magnification in the layer panel, it looks very blocky. That's because the layer panel inherits this value from the composition panel. That can often be very confusing and can cause some problems if you're doing something like rotoscoping or working with the rotobrush. So if you're doing something such as rotoscoping or working with the rotobrush, switch this to full, and then you get all of the pixel information in the layer panel. Note that it's often easier to use other commands for zooming in and out than always going to this menu and choosing. For example, you can use the mouse scroll wheel to scroll in and out, and keyboard shortcuts such as period and comma. I'm pressing the comma key now, and now I'm pressing the period key. And the same thing works in the layer panel, using the mouse scroll wheel, using period, using comma. The panels also both share a Grids and Guides button. If I click this, I can choose what grids and guides to show, including title and action safe guides, proportional grid, and rulers. I'll turn all these off. Both panels also share a current time control. You can click this to edit it. You can type a new value into the box and click OK, or just cancel. Both panels include the ability to take a snapshot. If I click this, a sound occurs and a snapshot has been taken. I can show the snapshot by clicking this button. If I show the snapshot now, it's just going to show me what was in the panel when I took the snapshot, which is the same thing that's in there now. So let's see how this works by moving the current time indicator to a different time. And now if I click Show Snapshot, you can see that it's showing me the snapshot in whatever panel I have active. I can do the same thing over here, and I'm showing the snapshot in the composition panel. This is very useful for comparing frames between two different times, or comparing two different results of effects being applied. Another control that both share is the Show Channel and Color Management Settings button. I can choose to show only the red channel, or the green channel, or the blue channel, or the alpha channel, which in this case, since we have a fully opaque image, is just all white, and RGB straight, which shows us the RGB values without considering the alpha channel. If we had a project working space set and we're using color management, we could also manipulate color management settings from here, but we don't. I'll go back to showing RGB. In both panels, we can also choose to show a region of interest. If I define a region of interest, then only the area within the region of interest is rendered. This is useful for previewing when something is very computationally intensive. If you're just rendering what's within this smaller rectangle, it can happen a lot faster. But we don't really need to do that right now, since we're not doing anything computationally intensive. So I'll turn this off. If you click the Toggle Transparency Grid button, you can either show a transparency grid or the background color. I'll move this layer a little bit so that we can see the transparency grid behind it. There it is. And if I turn it off, we're just seeing the background color. The transparency grid is often useful when you're working with transparency because it's a very distinctive pattern that lets you see where things are showing through. I'll press Ctrl-Z to undo that movement. Both panels also include a pixel aspect ratio correction button. This is used to toggle back and forth between showing pixels at their non-square aspect ratio or showing them as square pixels. It doesn't do anything in this case because we're working with square pixels. I'll expand the composition panel a little bit so that we can see more of its controls. Another control that both share is an exposure button. This doesn't actually change the composition, it just changes how you're previewing the composition. This can be useful for many purposes, such as when working on a composite, it's very often useful to move the exposure down and up to check and see whether the seams in your composite show. You can reset the exposure by clicking this button. The layer panel has some additional controls for viewing alpha channels. Let's open this logo precomposition layer. If I double-click on a precomposition layer, notice that it opens in the composition panel. But if I instead Alt double-click or Option double-click on macOS, it opens in the layer panel. So here we have our Vector Graphics logo on a transparent background. If I click this button, then it toggles back and forth between showing us the alpha channel or not. And if I click this, then a pink border is drawn on the boundary between opaque and transparent. If I click Toggle Alpha Overlay, then a color is overlaid on top of transparent areas. In this case, red, but we can change this here. If we want to go back to just showing regular RGB, we can do so from this menu. And we can toggle the transparency grid to just show it on the background. Another set of controls that only one of the panels has is the set of camera controls in the composition panel. When working in 3D, you can choose which camera to use, the active camera, or any of the cameras for the cardinal directions, or various custom views. And you can choose whether to show only one view or several all at once. This can be very useful when trying to position something and you want to see it from several angles at once as you do so. I'll go back to one view. Another feature of the layer panel is the view menu. Let's give ourselves a little bit more room in the layer panel here. And note that you can show the effects of masks, you can show the anchor point path, or you can just see the layer as it is as a source. If we make a little bit more room here, we can see the render option, which will render such things as effects into the layer panel. Let's open the logo precomposition in the composition panel to see one more set of things. We can see here that when we have a 3D layer, we can choose which renderer to use. But when we're looking at our other composition, which didn't have any 3D layers in it, it didn't bother to tell us which renderer we were using, because that's only really relevant for working in 3D. That's a quick tour of the composition panel and the layer panel. You'll be spending a lot of time in these panels in After Effects, so you'll become quite familiar with them.